When Ellen Damaris and I approached Susan Toner and asked her to speak many, many months ago, we didn't have the foresight to realize that we would be asking her to speak about 2 weeks after giving birth. Susan gave birth in late February to a 640,000 square foot hospital of the future. And I think we all know that child, don't we? We've all driven by it. We've seen it from ground zero be constructed to what it is now, and what a feat this was. It's the Hospital of the Future. It's the Mass Mutual Wing, and it houses the Davis Family Heart and Vascular Center. It's also going to house a much-needed 70,000 square foot emergency room. Susan and her dog Pippa moved here from Oregon in 2008. And she was charged with conducting a $23 million capital campaign. That is the largest, ladies, to ever take place in our area. And do you think it's a good time to be asking people for money? Because I don't know about that. With the economy the way it is and jobs the way it is, Susan had the job of raising this money, period, to support this new hospital of the future. I've read in human resource articles that great employees have intense focus, perseverance, and grit. And I think Susan probably needed all of those things to hit her goal and to support that effort. She is recognized nationally in the philanthropic community. And I can tell you from the short time that I've known her, she's a wonderful lady, and her story is going to inspire you. Her professional and personal story is very touching and inspiring, and I've been moved. And both times that I've had very long conversations with her, I've left feeling focused and re-energized about my own professional career. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to give you Susan Toner.
So if you ever get asked to speak, the one thing I would say is that the exercise of preparing for this particular event has given me more than it will give any of you, by I'm sure. It was very good exercise for me to go back through my life. Ellen and Janet and I talked about me kind of titling my speech Up the Ladder so that I could go through my journey and tell you what are those things that I did that helped me to arrive at where I am today. So thank you for being here, and I hope that you can take something away. Some of us remember our class songs, perhaps, chosen to be symbolic of our time in high school. And we may also remember the themes from our high school graduation, where we were launched into the world to make our mark, empowered by the infinite words of wisdom from one of the brightest and most mature fellow students that we were graduating with. And perhaps one or two of you were even the student that gave that speech, but I can guarantee that was not me. No one was going to ask me to do that. I was so unfocused as a student, and I didn't have a clue where I was headed. So my trip up this ladder has been terribly unorthodox. In preparing for today, I realized that along with the title of Up the Ladder, I was going to have to share my journey by saying it's also been a very long and winding road. And interestingly enough, that was my class song in high school. So many of you are familiar with the lyrics from that song that say, many times I've been alone, many times I've cried, and always, in any way you'll never know all the many ways I've tried, and still it leads me back to the long and winding road. Little did I know in my youth that this song would be prophetic if applied to my life in later years. So as I stand before you today, I have to admit, I still don't have a clue where I'm headed. Whether climbing the ladder or traveling that long and winding road, it's been a bit of a strange trip, and the truth is, life has chosen me. I have not chosen it. But when I was forced to look back to prepare for today, I realized that I've been richly blessed, and for that I'm extremely grateful. 60 years ago, I was born on a very large farm in a small town in western Missouri. We had an amazing red barn, which as a child seemed enormous to me. It had the biggest spiders I've ever seen. We had cows, chickens, pigs, sheep, corn, wheat, and beans. And just like western Massachusetts, many, many, many tornadoes. So we had help that lived on the property, and I fondly, fondly, fondly recall wonderfully soulful women who would sit on baskets that were turned upside down and snap beans in order to prepare them for canning. And while they were doing so, they would sing the sweetest gospel songs I've ever heard. I also distinctly remember sitting in the front window of the big old farmhouse on rainy days and picking which of the large trees I was going to climb to heaven. Oh, climbing the journey to heaven would be that easy. So today, when I go back there in my mind, I still smell the sweet air, and I feel safe, and I feel peaceful. When I was 7 years old, my parents decided it was time for a road trip, time to leave the farm and move to Idaho to be close to my mother's family. I remember sitting in the back seat of my father's, this will date me, air conditionless Chevy on a very, very hot southern style humid day with the windows rolled down and both of my parents sitting in the front seat smoking. It was a lovely affair. In the meantime, my sister and I were sitting in the back seat crying over about what we were, as we drove down the gravel road, realizing that we were about to leave that farm that we loved so dearly to begin a new chapter in our life. So we drove through golden farmlands to the beautiful Rocky Mountains, and the future that I didn't know was waiting for me allowed me to spend the rest of my years skiing in Sun Valley, Idaho. So even though I was sitting in the back seat crying, I didn't suffer too much in the end. But at a very young age, I had begun to learn about the need to appreciate and even embrace the different experiences that life would present. Disappointments, change, challenges, and new beginnings. And that, my friends, was the first rung of my ladder. There was another road trip when I was in the 8th grade. I remember looking out the window of our home, watching my friends on their first day of school as they walked up to a brand new junior high. That put envy at an all-time high in my life. The year before, I had been a cheerleader, and I was sure that my future was to be filled with great-looking athletes. Not so fast, though. The family car was parked in front of our house, and shortly my father would be driving my sister and I off to a college preparatory boarding school in Salt Lake City. Once again, I found myself in the back seat crying. At least my father had quit smoking by then. And I was weary knowing what I was about to leave behind. At the time, if you had asked me, I probably would have told you I was being sent to boarding school to hone my skills in how to get into trouble, because that seemed to be what I was best at. But my parents probably would have said that I was there to get a well-rounded education, including religion, academics, discipline, etiquette, exposure to the arts, travel, athletics, and the like. I can tell you that I had white glove inspections in my room, and that designated me as the Queen of Demerits. And so that prevented me from having any privileges at all for the next 5 years of my life. It wasn't until much, much later in my life that I began to appreciate the value that this experience would ultimately have. It was definitely the second rung on my ladder, as it influenced my worldliness, my sense of self-confidence, my faith, and those are critical attributes that have carried me through most of the situations in my life. By the way, it's also influenced me becoming a clean freak. I still can pass white glove inspections. So. After boarding school, the road led me to Idaho State University, where I studied speech pathology and audiology. And after years of boarding school exile, I enhanced my social life by joining the Gamma Phi Beta sorority. The reason I chose speech pathology and audiology was terribly illogical. At this point in my life, I still didn't have a clue what I wanted to be when I grew up. So I chose it because my sorority sisters had chosen it, and that seemed to be reasonable enough. Just as I was finishing those studies, I did my clinical rotations, and I worked with stroke patients, mostly elderly, who were often frustrated and more often than not grumpy. And I had an epiphany. This was absolutely not my calling in life and nothing that I ever wanted to do. So I had just wasted 4 years of education studying something I had no intentions of using. And unfortunately for my parents, they had spent money for 9 years of a very high quality education. And here I was pursuing a job in a clothing store in a local boutique. Not exactly what they had in mind for me. This, by the way, is a secret that I would keep from my children for many years. I expressed little tolerance for any floundering that they may want to pursue because I knew the pain that it could ultimately cause them. And while I never verbalized it to my children, I always carried my mother's voice saying, "Do as I say, not as I do," when I was influencing my children's decisions. However, while in pursuit of my degree, there was some good news. I became vice president of my sorority, and lo and behold, the role of vice president was to be the rush chairman and the fundraising chairman. In a most primitive fashion, I learned how to lead large groups of very young people who were far less than accountable, trust me. I learned to build quality relationships as we went through Rush with complete strangers and to persuade them to become engaged. I learned to set goals, take responsibility for outcomes, and set standards for excellence. And that was the third rung of my ladder. After school, right after school, at the ripe old age of 21, where I was so wise and knew everything and exactly what I was going to do with my life, my mother had never worked, so I figured that's pretty cool. Dress shop's not going out so well, so I'll just go find myself a man. So, so I did. I was very successful at that. So after school, I married my college sweetheart, who we had dated for 3 years, and that led us on the road to Green Bay, Wisconsin, where my very handsome, very athletic husband Tom Toner, played for the Green Bay Packers for 7 years. Proof that I had wisdom in junior high that no one saw. There were handsome athletes in my future. And I suppose for many of you that probably sounds glamorous, so I'm here to dispel that. It started by me getting pregnant fairly soon after we moved to Green Bay and having to endure my morning sickness in a paper mill and meat packing town. I don't know if any of you have ever had that experience, but I was pretty sure that the smells of that community were going to kill me before my child was ever born. It was the worst. Windows shut, candles glowing, and lying on the bathroom floor crying. It was a pretty thing. I had to disguise myself in public while we were in Green Bay, Wisconsin, so that I wouldn't be assaulted by overzealous fans who were in a rage because the team had lost yet again. 7 years of losing. And then there was the time when my parents came to see a game and they brought family friends. We sat right behind a fan who for the entire game yelled that my husband was worthless and should be kicked out of the game. It was very uncomfortable. At halftime, I tapped him on the shoulder and calmly said, "I'm pretty certain you paid more for your ticket than I did, and I respect your right to be an enthusiastic fan, but I'd just like to introduce myself." I said, "I'm Mrs. Tom Toner, and since I have guests with me, you're making me kind of uncomfortable." Well, his friends started to laugh hysterically. They thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard, and needless to say, he got up and left, didn't come back for the second half of the game. If I'd known that was going to happen, I would have paid him for his ticket so he'd feel better about the experience. Then there was the time that I was sitting on an aisle and the fan in front of me had had just a little bit too much to drink and he passed out with his head in my lap. Because I was sitting on the aisle, if I had moved, he surely would have rolled down the stairs to an immediate death. So I had to sit there and tolerate that the whole time. And then there was the time when the team was actually winning and they were headed to the playoffs. The game before the playoffs, my husband, who was a linebacker, which for those of you who don't know is a defensive position that doesn't score points, had intercepted a ball. He had run to the 1 yard line, embarking on what would have been his historic touchdown, and he tripped on his own shoelace, fell, broke his collarbone, and was out for the season. So there you go for my romantic time in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And may I just mention, Green Bay is probably the coldest place in the world. And they play the Florida teams and they play the California teams at home in December, and they have elected never, ever, ever to have an enclosed stadium. This year I had a fun time though. I was given the gift of 2 inside seats to take my daughter to the Detroit game when they were in the playoffs. So I finally had a good Green Bay experience. It was pretty cool. So being my husband's fan was indeed a challenge, but while we were there I gave birth to both of my children, Polly and Ryan, which made it more than worthwhile. Also, while I was there, I spent many weekends alone, and I was with all the wives on the team while the team was on the road, learning to be independent, run our home, and my family. Men were gone 6 months a year during that period of time in the NFL. You never saw them. When they had games, they lived in motels. Before the games, they couldn't be around their family. So it was very different than the NFL is today. But as fate would have it, I filled my time by joining and ultimately leading the players' wives as volunteers and honing my fundraising skills by organizing events for the NFL chapter of the United Way. I eventually became the chairman of the NFL chapter of the United Way, and during that time I learned the importance of working within the confines of a very established not-for-profit setting, adhering to their guidelines and striving to meet their goals. I am matured in my ability to understand how best to engage my peer volunteers in a meaningful experience, how to balance lots of very healthy egos, and to meet the expectations of people with means when they were making their philanthropic gifts. This was the 4th rung of my ladder.